Welcome to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds, featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I am your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations and to shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. I am excited to share that we have launched our 2024 listener survey, and we can't wait to hear from you. All you have to do is simply click the link in the show notes, answer a few questions, and you'll be entered into our end-of-year giveaway. Your insights are invaluable as we plan episodes for 2025, ensuring that we continue to deliver great MTSS content and engaging guests. Now for today's episode. I often said as a middle school teacher that I spent more time helping my students be humans more than anything else. And there are so many aspects of doing school that have to be modeled, like how to organize a notebook, how to use your time efficiently, setting goals, and all of which are executive functioning skills. And in the past few years, educators have seen more and more executive dysfunction. And so today I am excited to have on the show Mitch Weathers, author, speaker, teacher, creator of Organized Binder, which is a system to help teach executive function skills for students. So welcome, Mitch.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, so since we're talking about skills today, I always like to kind of ask a fun question, but what skill do you wish you had had as a student in middle school or high school? Like, what's a skill you have now that you're like, man, I wish I had had that skill back then?
Well, there's there's quite a few, but I think at a base and with this work, when I get asked like, where should I start? And I always say, start with the organization, because take any and to our conversation before we started recording, most middle school boys, organization may not come naturally. And I remember that feeling in middle school and high school. And the funny thing is, I remember getting a binder and just trying to figure it out. It's like, oh, I guess that's what you're supposed to do. I didn't really have any coherent system, but what I've seen, and this is more of from my experience as a teacher all these years, students are, just at a base, they're more successful when they're organized, because the partially completed or fully completed assignment that's stuffed in the book bag or your desk or somewhere all of a sudden isn't lost anymore. And that has an impact on your grades. But more importantly, I think when we look at how, and I tell a story in my book about a student who, I won't ruin the story, but she got organized, and it was in my classroom, and I'll never forget. I walked over and just said, "Look, good job. You got your binder back together." And she looked up at me and she was like, "I actually feel better." And she kind of like motioned to, like, patted her chest, like inside. And I said, "It's true. Like, when you learn to get and stay organized and you kind of own that skill, it's your own, we feel better. We're more efficient, or oftentimes more effective in what we're trying to do." So yeah, looking back, I think that would have been good for me.
Yeah, I was thinking that that's probably, and I like to think that I was organized back then because I definitely had the binders. Well, I would love for you to kind of start out by just sharing a little bit about your background and kind of how you ended up doing the work that you're doing today.
I'll back up quite a ways, because I taught in the classroom for many years. And prior to that, I worked in the nonprofit space with middle school and high school age kids, and realized I still want to work with kids, but I don't really want to be an ED and run a nonprofit. And made the transition, went back to graduate school, and made the transition to the classroom. And I only bring that up because what I've learned too in supporting new teachers, we do a lot of work with teacher prep programs, so pre-service teachers. For some, not all, but for some, even if they're really young, like those teachers that are 22, 23, they're like back in a high school classroom, like, you just left. Figuring out how to like interface and interact with this alien species called middle school or high schoolers can take some time. to just kind of figure that out. And when I entered the classroom, that was like, of the things I had in my kind of toolkit, was relationships and management, of course, is kind of hand in glove with that. And so just being around students, and it, when I first started, I started at a large comprehensive Title I urban public high school. And it was lively. It was rough at times. And you really had to have those management chops. And um, I just remember being in the classroom and just kind of confused because it seemed like there was something missing. And so
Mm.
I went back when I got my credential. I also did a master's degree, and my thesis was the impact of student teacher relationships on learning and academic success. So there's the relationship side. But my actual degree is in cross-cultural pedagogy. And I find myself in this
Mm.
classroom with all multi-language learners, right? So cross-cultural pedagogy, I'm supposed to be the person who knows. And I was just like, something's missing. And I taught science, um, high school science, mostly ninth grade. And so, it's a subject that by default can be kind of fun and engaging. We can go
Mhm.
outside, we can cut things open, we can light things on fire, we can, all the stuff you can do, right? And I was doing all that and it was engaging, but I just was haunted by something's missing. And then it dawned on me one day, like, oh, you don't know how to do school. That's
Mm.
what's going on here. And as I got to know these students, it was two things became very clear. One, they're entirely capable, all of them. I was like, wow, you gifted individuals, but most of them had a history of academic struggle and failure, and had been viewed through a deficit lens most of their experience. And it was just became very clear to me. It's like, oh, you're being perceived by what you don't bring to the classroom, as opposed to an asset lens that sees that
Mhm.
differently. Um, and then the good thing for them was I was never a very confident student either. And so I talk about this in the book quite a bit. Is Paulo Freire has this idea of being like a passive object as opposed to an active subject. And I remember sitting in classes and feeling like, okay, I'm here and it's going on all around me, but I don't understand how to quite jump into this with like dexterity and agency, but other
Mm.
kids in the room seem to know how to do it. And I saw that in my students, and I just started trying to figure out like what's missing. And where that led to was this specific set of executive functioning skills that when any student for that matter, but when they start to get equipped with these skills, it changes that narrative. So that's a long-winded answer, but that's how I ended up here.
Well, I like that story of that idea of you as a passive student because, I think that there are many students that it feels like you're just here letting school happen to you instead of being the active
Right.
participant, which I think then sometimes leads to that a life like that, letting life happen to you instead of sort of being an active participant.
Hmm.
Um, and so
No
I
doubt.
I like that you kind of told that story. I want to talk a little bit about executive functioning skills, sort of just to define it, sort of to kind of a baseline for all of our listeners. And it can manifest itself in lots of different ways in different age groups. Can you maybe share a little bit about some of those key differences between that maybe teachers might observe in younger students versus older students?
Yeah. Um, that's a great question. Um, and to back up just a little bit, there's a lot of, kind of quote unquote academic or wordy definitions of executive functioning skills. And I like to use one word that I didn't coin. A school that we work with the Organized Binder, coined this. They reached out to us and they had collectively agreed, like come to this understanding of we need and want to develop studentness in our students
Mm.
collectively. And then just ask like, what's that mean? What is that? What is studentness? And we've collaborated with them for many years now, and it became so clear like, oh, that's a great definition of these executive functioning skills within the teaching, learning, or classroom, even if it's not a traditional classroom context. So I like to just envision a student with studentness, it's that the opposite of that passive. It's this active subject, and those are things we just historically don't teach or model
Mm.
for students. So what they look like in a classroom, the bigger kids, if we stay with organization, um, and we can get into the modeling and routine and all of that, but executive functioning in the bigger kiddos is going to look, ideally, depending on when students start to develop these, there's an inflection point around third and fourth grade where we sometimes, non-verbally, just assume that students are going to start becoming more independent learners.
Mm.
And if students start to practice and hone these skills, and what that does look like as they get older is they are a little more autonomous, independent. They know how to get and stay organized. They've had practice setting goals. Ideally, they've learned how to manage a calendar of some
Mhm.
sort. And that's going to look different in like sixth grade than it would in 11th grade. And again, that's all predicated on getting practice with this, because if you never have, and it's not uncommon, and you're
Yeah.
working with big kiddos and junior seniors in high school,
Yeah.
if they've not any fault of their own, if they haven't had any practice. So that, I would say, if that answers your question, the older, the younger, it's really quite interesting to me, because I'm not a primary teacher, I'm not a kinder
Mhm.
teacher. But if you ask preschool, TK, K, 1, 2, anybody in those age groups, they're like, this is exactly what we should be teaching. Executive functions is what we need to be teaching
Yeah.
our kids. And as you get older, it becomes more and more and more about the content,
Mhm.
right? So, kind of inherent to those classrooms, um, hopefully, at least that's been my experience, as teachers are just, they see that in the
Mhm.
younger kiddos. A lot of it, in conversations and work, and even kind of like some interesting focus groups we've done, it has a lot to do with, self-regulation,
Mm.
self-monitoring, um, and
Mhm.
how I'm being in the learning space, as
Mhm.
opposed to, is your binder organized? A
Yeah.
kindergartner
Yeah.
shouldn't have
A
a
binder. No.
binder in the same
Yeah.
way that a fourth grader should. So that's been, it's more about the relationship side of
Mhm.
things, but recognizing that even then, like, take goal setting, for example. Sure, it's going to look a little different than it would in middle school, but certainly kids in kindergarten can set goals.
Yeah.
And what I've learned is that the sooner that starts happening, the more likely students are to start to develop some of these
Yeah.
skills over time.
Well, and I think some of that executive functioning for younger kids is how to participate in a group. How do you interact with
Correct.
people around you? Transitions, I know like some of that has to do with emotional regulation. Students that maybe struggle in transitions,
Right.
going from one activity to another, just those kind of things that you may do in school, I think is part of that executive functioning.
Yeah. And
And
it's,
that's where some of those foundational things I think come in to play, what you're talking about.
yeah. And when we look at it within the classroom context, that's all about clarity, for oftentimes for those students. So
Yeah.
if there's ambiguity in that transition, or where I'm supposed to do, for some kids it's not going to be a problem at all, and for others it's very problematic.
Yeah.
So when we look at what we can do in terms of shaping the environment, that clarity piece can be really helpful, because it's oftentimes those younger, it's about play and it's about
Yeah.
emotion, and right.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking that about routines and how that is so like you talk a lot about routines in your
Mhm.
book about just the the routine of being organized and setting yourself up for those for those routines, and that starts a lot with how how a teacher may structure the classroom. And I noticed that as when I first stepped into a 7th grade teaching a 7th grade classroom, not understanding that like having the papers they needed to get at the same spot every day. Like if I moved them
Mhm.
around, like it was chaos because they didn't know where to go. And I had
Yeah.
a teacher that was so kind of like, "Hey, sweetie, just put them in the same spot.
Good
By
for you.
October, they'll get it. They'll know where to go if you have that routine." And I was just and I think that was sort of the thing I didn't anticipate so much,
Right.
having to work with 7th graders about like, I was like, oh, you have to teach them how to do some of this stuff, where to write their name on the paper, where,
Oh, yeah.
like all of those things. And they're encountering this was, when they were coming in from 6th grade into a middle school for the first time, 7 different types of
Massive.
routines,
Yeah.
that transitional period. I just talked to somebody on the podcast about sort of that emotional readiness about transitions, different transitions in your educational career. And I always think about how that some of that executive dysfunction coming into middle school or high school can happen because there's so many new routines and new things to encounter, and you just
Everything's
may
new.
not have some kids may be better at that than others, but like how do you deal with that transition? How do you set yourself up for a new year? All of those different things. So,
It's,
um
I mean, it's not an understatement to say for many students that it's a quantum leap going to middle school, and then that we know that the data's clear on the ninth grade transition. But
yeah.
I can't echo Lisa Delpit says it well, that we have to be careful not to move the very explicitness that students need to thrive in a new environment.
Mhm.
And it's especially that middle school and high school setting, well, even elementary, um, we're so siloed. And
Yeah.
you live in your little, like me, ninth grade science or sixth grade ELA, and not that, but you want to, but you tend to, it's your environment, and you're trying to, make it this thing for students. But where there's real power is when we share predictable routines, and we
Yeah.
we get collective about things, because ultimately what we're talking about with that, you said 7 different classes. I tell a story in the book of a middle school I spoke at. It was a district wide symposium, and we all met at this middle school, and I saw the bell schedule was 10 different classes a day with lunch. And I mean, it's just like a mad sprint. I mean, can you imagine? And
Oh my gosh.
what we're ultimately talking about here is cognitive load. And I like to use um, the expression mental calories. And we only have so
Mm.
many. Like, working memory is finite, and it's kind of the engine for learning. And the more extraneous load, the less capacity I have to focus on what I'm trying to learn, which of course is related to self-regulation and behavior. We're talking about the little kiddos. Like,
Yeah.
if there's a significant cognitive load, I have less capacity to self-monitor, to self-regulate.
Mm.
And if I can get some clarity, even though at your school, let's say it was a 6, 7, 8, I don't know what your
It
school
was
is, but
just a 7-8.
7, 8. So the quick one. So you go from this, and I talk about this in the book. Every year up until sixth grade, I'm in sixth grade now. I'm getting ready for this transition. Every year, this year, and then every year prior, I had one teacher, most likely, that loved on me and got to know me and my family. And then I get to sixth grade, and not only, I mean, that's still happening, but the narrative shifts on me, because all anybody's talking about is middle school. And there's going to
Mhm.
be big kids and lockers and different classes. And that's anxiety producing for a lot of
Oh, yeah.
students.
The
But
locker situation
all
itself,
of it, it's
I
just
think kids had night I mean, I think I still have nightmares about that as a
right.
6th
Yeah, it's
grader,
not like
yeah.
the TV shows we see with hanging out by the locker. There's real anxiety and all that, and there's also a ton of ambiguity. But
Mhm.
let's say that middle school, what if every one of those teachers collectively committed to implement the same routine?
Mhm.
So even though it's a different place on campus, and of course a different content and a different culture, because there's different people in the room, but how we do school, how we transition, where we put our stuff,
Mhm.
how we conclude, if that all looks the same, all of a sudden I'm not using mental calories just to navigate the school day. And that's exacerbated for students with learning differences, students for
Oh,
whom English is a second language. There's an equity. This quickly becomes an equity and even social justice conversation around
yeah.
cognitive load and the capacity. So
Yeah.
it's
Well, I was
fascinating.
just thinking any of those students with, neurodivergent students who maybe have different capacities for that mental load. I was just thinking of, like, that's why the struggle was so much, more for some of those students that
Oh,
maybe encountered
absolutely.
that. Like, I like the idea of the mental calories. That's a really great way to think
Yeah.
about it.
Right. Because you
Um,
only have so many, just like running
yeah.
anything, and if I'm not monitoring that and nurturing that and refilling that,
Yeah.
and
That's why
reduce.
7th hour was the hardest hour
Oh yeah.
to teach.
That's another thing I talk about in the book is I taught, like I said, all multi-language kiddos, and my morning classes, there was a vibrancy there that just was not there at the end of the day. There was a fatigue. And I used to joke to myself and with colleagues that, this because they've learned so much today that their brains full. I'm like, no, they've been literally translating everything they're reading and hearing the entire school day
Mhm.
and sitting right next to oftentimes their English speaking classmate that isn't doing any of that.
Yeah.
And that's just exhausting.
So
And then if I
exhausting.
don't know how I just left English and now I'm in math, and what do we do? What's the starting routine here or lack thereof? Like it,
Yeah.
for those kiddos in particular, yeah, it's
Yeah.
significant.
So, I mean, and we can kind of transition to that idea that, with all of this, I mean, this is impacting how they're performing academically,
Hmm.
and so maybe like how maybe you can share a little bit about how these skills, building these skills over time, can contribute to maybe improved academic performance over time, or just improve student outcomes. If it's a collective, what you've seen people working collectively to build these skills has led to.
Yeah. So the collective, if you look at the research, um, the effect size, John Hattie's work. And if you haven't, and you're listening, just look up visible learning and check it out. It's fascinating
Yes.
research, I think. And it's answering, John asked one question that we all ask, like, what has the greatest impact on student success? And if we can figure out what some of that is, then why don't we do more of that stuff? And the stuff that's not contributing, which might be adding to the extraneous load, cognitive load, let's do less of that, right? And at the top of the heap, I mean, almost consistently is something called collective teacher efficacy. And if we all get collective, it does have an impact. But I mentioned this earlier, I'm empathetic because we are so siloed,
Mhm.
right? I've never met a teacher or a parent or an educator, school leader, whoever, district leader that doesn't want students to set goals, learn to get and stay organized, manage their time, hold themselves accountable,
Yeah.
self-regulation. I mean, everyone's like, yes, 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 this is what we need to do, but we historically just kind of hope that students pick these up, right? But here's where it gets interesting because when you were teaching middle school, you weren't hired to teach executive functioning skills,
No, I was not hired to
right?
teach kids how to be human. That was not on
No,
my
no,
job
that was your
description.
thing. And most teachers understand that. Like
Yeah.
content is second. It's not that it's less important. It's just like an order of operations. But unfortunately, we don't get to go first and then second because
Mhm.
you're hired to teach fifth grade or ninth grade science like me. So it has to be concurrent. And here's where I unpack in the book is look, on top of never meeting a teacher that doesn't want students to develop these skills, I've also never met a teacher that has excess time on their hands, right? So we have this intense time crunch. And although I want my students to develop these, when am I going to fit it in? Which is why it's really important to understand this work is not a curriculum. In fact, executive functioning skills aren't even taught in the traditional sense of the word. They're best learned when
Mm.
students clearly see them modeled, hence the binder, and they get daily practice with them by engaging in the routine. So what happened for me, and probably the only reason we're chatting here, is I developed this program called Organized Binder in my class. That's its name because kids were excited that they were organized. And they'd be, look at my organized binder. And it just stuck, right? Colleagues started showing up and asking, like, what's going on in here? Because I'm working with the same kids and it's not going well. And everyone's talking about this binder in Mr. Weathers' classroom. What do you got going on? And so I started sharing it, and it was really bringing that clarity piece. Like, here's exactly what it looks like. I also became obsessed at that time because I was figuring out this cognitive load and these mental calories. I'm working with multi-language kiddos, and I said I'm relying far too much on verbal communication alone, and that's back to the equity thing. So
Yeah.
how could I communicate my expectations and my routine and not use any words? And that's
Mm.
where the binder, and it's color coded and different steps of the routine. It's a different color. So there was absolute clarity. But what happened was other teachers started using it. And then by the end of that school year, the 9th grade team at my school, not my choice, adopted it school wide. And
Mm.
what I stumbled upon, and I'll say this, I had no idea. I wasn't like, the one doing the research. It was collective teacher efficacy became a real thing on our campus, and you could feel it. I mean, something shifted on campus. We didn't have the language for it. And here's the deal: is we got collective around clarity, routine. We all adopted a common, predictable routine. It's one of the subtitles of my book. And then we modeled the use of these organized binders for students so they could always see it.
Yeah.
And here's the deal: nobody was teaching executive functioning skills. The binder is the tool to participate in the routine. And when I'm engaged in this routine, I get daily practice employing these skills. I'm
Yeah.
practicing getting organized while I see it. I'm practicing managing a calendar. I'm setting goals. I'm flexing my working memory through retrieval practice. But it's just steps in the routine within the context of whatever it is I'm learning, whatever you're teaching, grade level or subject.
Mhm.
So that's where the collective piece is about saying, yeah, we can all commit to clarity, routine, and modeling. And when we do, literally a byproduct of that is students are honing these skills.
Yeah. I mean, what a better, there's no better testament to the effectiveness of something you try in your classroom when a teacher goes, "Hey, what are you doing in your classroom? Because that kid isn't,
It's not
I want
working.
that same result in my, I mean, that's how you get, I mean, we talk a lot about buy-in around MTSS, on the podcast. And that's how you
Mm,
get buy-in is like, you're seeing the results one place and you're like, I want those results.
mhm.
And that's how it spreads,
And how can
and
it be? Yeah. And how
yeah.
can it be replicated? Because if it can't,
Yeah.
then what's going on there, right?
Because there's a lot of times that, that's because if it goes around a personality, right? Like if the teacher has this certain kind of personality and certain kind of relationship with kids, that's one thing. But if it's
Sure.
an actual tool, that's something different. Because I do think that
Hmm.
that's hard to replicate. Of like,
Can't.
because not all teachers have the same personality, and like sometimes kids were great in my class because we got along versus they didn't get along.
Of
That's
course.
different. But I think that is when it centers around a tool that you're using that can easily be duplicated and used in the same way,
Right.
or in a school-wide manner. That's a fantastic way to get that collective efficacy. Really, buy-in is really collective efficacy to the, whatever you're working towards. But
And
um
to you made a point earlier, that that veteran teacher saying, put the papers here every single day, and by October they'll get it. And what happens with this collective efficacy around clarity, routine, and modeling is, to your point, it's totally possible. It doesn't interfere with your teaching. And in fact, once it's collective, teachers report back they have more instructional time because we're painting some of the gray areas, what I call them, black and white, right, about clarity. But what I've often told teachers over the years is like, hey, be as creative. Like you brought up, different personalities, different subjects, different grade levels. Like, of course, I was in 3rd grade last year. I'm in 4th grade. It's different. And I
mhm.
really personally believe it should be that who you are as a teacher and how you bring that to your craft. I mean, that's a big part of this, the energy, the excitement, all of that, right? The relationships. Be as creative as you can with your lesson plans and what you're teaching and how you're teaching. Never mess with your routines.
Mhm.
Keep them
Oh,
predictable, because the more predictable, the safer that environment feels. I spend a
yeah.
lot of time on this in the book, and we can't forget that for many students, life outside of school is anything but predictable, and it
Mhm.
might even skew towards chaotic. And so when I can consistently and routinely find myself an environment that's predictable, like I can predict what's going to happen and I know what to do to engage,
Yeah.
that's where that agency, that's that thing that I never really felt like I figured out. I got through school, but that's what my students lack too. It's like, how do I do this? And it's like, well, I'm going to show you how you do this. It
Yeah.
looks just like this. And once you get that clarity, and only then, if you dive into the chapter on accountability, only then can we start talking about accountability,
Mhm.
right? So,
Yeah. Well, and there was a quote I wanted to talk about in your book. I'm going to read it because I thought it was a really great. It kind of transitions to this next part I want to ask you about, but it says student self-efficacy around school grows as their executive functioning skills increase. And this is the one source of strength or tenacity needed to hang in there and not give up when school and life gets tough. And I thought that that was such a great point in the idea of like when you have that, you're talking about safe environment and that idea of their ability to encounter problems that are outside of the routine or different. When they feel like they're more confident in other areas, they can kind of tackle some of those like problems that they encounter. And you talk a lot about sort of that mindset being important.
mm,
Could you share maybe a few approaches to fostering some of that growth mindset in students who struggle with maybe even just starting the tasks that are associated with some learning these skills?
yeah, that's a really good question, and I believe deeply in this truth. Um, First, we need to recognize oftentimes success in the classroom is tied entirely to content or doing well with the content. And what I've seen in students, you know, getting back to my multi-language kiddos, neurodiverse kiddos, um, and just any student for that matter, depending on what we're learning, if I'm not successful with the content, then there's a risk that I might be less engaged or willing to kind of lean in to my education because I'm struggling, right? And if that kind of, and what I hear you kind of speaking towards is that self-fulfilling prophecy of like I can't do it, right? Every math teacher on the planet knows this. I can't do math. I'm horrible at math. Well,
Mm,
why? When did that happen? Because you can do math. We know your brains can do math, right? And that's a
yeah.
powerful narrative to try to reverse. So you asked like, what does it look like for students? Because this is, I'm just going to speak to my classroom now. Like this is this routine, and all I mean by routine is how we begin, how we transition, where we put our stuff, organized, how we transit, how we conclude, right? In and around the whole lesson plan. Well, that's a collective implementation. We're all doing this together.
Mm,
And so students are, regardless of how they're doing with the content, are held accountable for engaging in this routine. And I tell a story in the book about gold stars, and I won't spoil it all here. But one of my sayings is we need to pack as many celebrated victories into the first 2 minutes of class as humanly possible. And the celebrated part is key, right? Giving students opportunities for success within an academic context that aren't tied to content, which is why I've been trying to get this message across loud and clear for years now. Never start the school day or the class period with a quiz because it gives students the opportunity to fail. And our most fragile kiddos at that moment, that's the last thing they need is to fail. And if I do that every day, then I have the opportunity to fail every day. And that's
mhm,
less likely for me to engage. And so what I saw happening in my class, and I was very strategic about it, but I had to recognize like, hey, you brought your pencil today. And I'm telling you, like when I first started getting to work on this, when I say studentness, many of my students, they just kind of like drifted into class, stayed there, and then they left. And they
mhm,
would come back the next day and they didn't have anything from the previous day. They didn't have, like, there was no connections being made. And so when my, for example, the beginning routine with all of this work, um, not only am I modeling it for students in class, well, if there's 30 kiddos in the room, then as they're starting to get ready, you can see what it looks like, where you need to be in the binder for us to kick the class off. And I could walk around and start to acknowledge students who normally weren't doing that, and we're starting to, or we're
mhm,
starting to get organized. And just by acknowledging, and again, speaking in ninth grade, it may have not been like this public celebration because that wasn't cool. But if I could little bump on the shoulder, hey, good job, right, you got that, I've seen it start to shift student behavior in that, like, who doesn't want to feel successful and be acknowledged for that? And again, keep in mind that the byproduct of engaging in the routine, right? And I'll just go through the steps real quick. I know we're not doing any screen sharing, but we start each day with retrieval practice, which is like, if we want to talk about learning and long-term retention, retrieval is where it's at.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
retrieval practice, and then spacing that out, spaced retrieval and interleaving. And there's these things. That's how we begin every time, by looking back and saying, here's where we came from. This isn't a quiz. It's okay if you don't remember it. In fact, the science of learning suggests that it's actually a good thing if you forgot it and now you have to retrieve it. And if
Yeah.
you do that multiple times, it's more likely, right, to
Yeah.
stick. Second step of the routine is I get to introduce what we're doing today, but I'm also doing it through the context of modeling how you keep a calendar. How do you do that? Most adults never had anybody show them how to do that. And so I find myself in college all these years later, and a professor hands me a syllabus, and I'm supposed to just be ready to go week 15. And no one's going to talk about it because you're in college now. And if I've
Yeah.
never had anyone show me how to maintain a
Mhm.
calendar, manage, planning and time management, I'm less likely to be successful.
Yeah.
So it's retrieval practice, planning and time management. And then the third step is we take a moment with our table of contents and our academic toolkit to get organized. Before every single lesson, every day I model, and within seconds or a minute, you're also doing the same. And anything you're going to create or I'm going to hand out or whatever has a specific place where it lives. I always
Mhm.
tell kids, if it does, it's more likely to find its way home. It
Yeah.
lives right there. And we're going to practice every day putting it there. And over time, repetition, these habits and these skills move into our subconscious. And it's like, hey, I got this now. Like
Yeah.
this is mine. So
Yeah. Well, and as you talk, it makes I like all of these memories of my time in the classroom are like popping up, and I'm thinking like, oh, like this is why, even when you start the year with a notebook and I taught English, and so we had a notebook where we would take notes. you know and the struggle was I always had struggled to, with now that kids have laptops, like how do you integrate some of these kind of things? Do you have anything to comment about, like, now the sort of the prevalent use of technology, and maybe just like the urge for us to try to like organize kids around technology? Is there ways to use that in this kind of system, or do you
mhm.
find that like maybe having just a binder is the better way for kids to be more successful? I'm just curious.
Yeah. No, that's a great question that I get asked every single day. Right.
And I say
Right.
this
Totally.
knowing that my district administrator, who's like, we just spent all this money on laptops. Why do kids need any other material besides their laptop? That's
Right.
maybe what they're going to ask. So I'm just
Right.
curious how you
Right.
respond.
Yeah. And I think there's some truth in that, the Chromebook, is the new textbook. And that, I have a lot of to say on this topic. But the first thing, well, there's two things I always start with: why? Because we have this propensity to be like, oh, it's education technology. It's a new this, it's a new device, it's a new app, it's this, it's good for learning. And I'm always like, okay, it might be, but can you unpack the why? Like really explain
Mhm.
why. Now, one why is, well, kids aren't carrying around in middle school 5 textbooks. That could be a why for a
Yeah.
Chromebook. There used to be this thing that we used to monitor before the pandemic called screen time. And that has left the global lexicon. I actually wrote an article about it, which is really fascinating, right? We just don't talk about
Yeah.
it anymore.
Yeah.
And we know it's a good thing for kids and old people alike to not be on a screen. That's true.
Yeah.
Um, but the other thing I'll say is that it's not a either or, and these
Mm.
absolutely dovetail. So you asked about the binder, and the Child Mind Institute. You can see it. I think it's in the preface or something of my book. They even came out and said, look, for students who need practice with these skills and habits, a binder beats a notebook. It beats this. It beats this. There's something and there's gosh, there's a lot I want to say here. Um, some things are best learned by doing, right?
Yeah.
There's a really neat native Hawaiian expression that is, the knowing is in the doing. I'll spare you the Hawaiian translation. Um, there's just certain things, and we
Yeah.
work with some schools and folks in Hawaii, and that they were the ones that shared that with me. They were like, "Oh, this is exactly what this phrase means when you talk about executive functioning skills. The knowing is in the doing. You have to do it.
Yeah.
Um, and I always like to say as well, um, not all education technology. What is technology? Does it all have a screen? No, we think that way now because
Yeah.
we have all these screens in our lives, which is can be leveraged for great things. It's not
Yeah.
it's not an either or. It's a blend of the two. But what I like to say, just to make people think differently, is I hold up an organized binder. I'm like, this is an education technology for developing executive functioning skills. It actually is a
Hmm.
technology, if you stop and think about it. Now, I believe that the analog, well, first of all, there's going to be, mark my words on this, this is my prediction. Analog's not going anywhere, right? Why, and it's not just social media. Why are schools banning phones? Attention, trying to pay attention in class. Like there's some interesting things happening
Yeah.
now that I heard someone speak at a conference recently, Research Ed in Delaware a couple of weeks ago. Um, that he made a great statement. I think that, cell phones should have been banned from schools the moment they were invented. And we're just now getting around to seeing their impact.
Yeah.
Again, does that mean technology doesn't have a place in the classroom? Of course not. Um, but I think it's going about it in a blended fashion. So what I've seen is starting with the analog and doing it, seeing it modeled, and then very calculated as a teacher, starting to leverage that over into the digital realm.
Yeah.
And I've seen it all day long. And let's be honest, Google Drive and Google Classroom or whatever you're using can be the digital version of the book bag,
Yeah.
right? Just having a laptop does not mean you're learning any of these skills and making them your own. And technology in and of itself did not enter the classroom. I mean, let's just be honest, and then I'll get off my little soapbox here. But Google and Apple and everyone else didn't come into the classroom for teaching and learning. There's other motives
Yeah, I was gonna say
behind
that's
some of these
not that
things,
they hold hold the bar high for pedagogical,
right?
functions.
But gifted teachers can leverage lots of different technologies and other assets for teaching and learning. And that's what's really interesting is that
Mhm.
blend. And then
Yeah.
I'll just leave you with this before we move on. I've used Organized Binder in a fully asynchronous, self-paced, virtual independent study program. And all of my students had a physical binder. They wrote down now, of course, all their curriculum, everything was through the Chromebook,
Yeah.
but they were taking notes by hand. And I had them doing that not only because we know the cognitive science behind handwriting as opposed to
Mhm.
laptop, right? It's a deeper cognition and you're more likely to hold on to it. But I also wanted them to have assets that got messy so that they could practice organization. And
Yeah.
if everything was digital, right? So I had our table of contents, and then the simple thing to do was somehow identifying here's our unit of study, what we're progressing through. Which of these assignments or assets are here in the real world with us, and which are digital?
Yeah.
And you make a little insignia, and then I go to, let's say, Google Drive. There's a folder there just the same name as my table of contents, those digital assignments. So I'm starting to transfer those skills into a
Yeah.
digital realm. So,
Yeah. Well, I appreciate all that you said about that too, because I do think it is about a balance. But I think when coming back to that idea of routine of like there's still ways to use technology, or I mean, I did this a lot during the pandemic. We'd have I structured all the modules the same, and we'd all do, we did the same stuff, like you go here, then we do this. Some of that routine and that predictability can be built in that
oh,
way. I think it just
absolutely.
depends on the classroom, and even I think it even works better when your whole team or your whole school is following some of the same routine. And we tried to do that a lot during the pandemic so that you know kids wouldn't be like, I don't know where to go to find this stuff, and
Mhm.
also to explain to parents. And it's
Right.
just like so much easier.
Yeah, that's
Well,
that
I
clarity piece,
yeah,
right?
that
That
clarity.
transcends analog, digital, whatever. It's, are we collectively bringing clarity? And I love how you brought up the family piece,
Yeah.
because that ambiguity can be
Oh,
on the home side too. Like, where is stuff? How do I, right?
well, I hear that from parents all the time of, like, the many different apps they have to go to, and I always say clarity is kindness, and I think that the more clear
That's
you can
great.
be about the different aspects of what a student is encountering, and understanding that one parent may have 3 or 4 students that have, lots of different things, so,
And that might
um
be a single parent who's limited on time and
yeah.
wants to support, like, again, that clarity. But at Organized Binder, we have a bilingual guide for families print that goes home. It's a gift
Mhm.
to explain the routine it's happening in class, with prompts and questions to ask the kid to take the conversation beyond, like, do you have any
Oh,
homework? How was school today?
yeah.
Did you learn anything? Right? Those kind of tried and true that it's like, no, I don't have any homework. We didn't learn anything new. It's like, really? You went to school all day, you didn't learn anything new, right? That's my ninth grader right now. Like, how did you go to 6 classes and not learn anything new? But I'll just say this real quick because you brought up that home and parent. They love it because of the clarity.
Mm.
It's like, here's where they're going to set their goals with an actionable daily task. Can you check in with them about that periodically throughout this quarter? Here's their reflections. If you want to see what they're learning every day or what they're confused about, maybe it's going to be right
Yeah.
here. If you want to see what we did, it's right here. If you want to find their assignments and their work, it's right here. And so now, supporting my kid at home with their homework or study or whatever it might be, there's absolute clarity. And imagine back to that middle school, what if that was for every class?
Yeah.
Pretty
That's
powerful.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, Mitch, I could probably ask you questions all day about this
Yeah. Are
because
we done? We can't be. Are we
I
done
mean,
already?
we're
I'm just kidding. I
kind of
don't
nearing
know.
the end of our time, but I mean,
Okay.
I have some audience members that may love an hour long episode.
Depends on their commute. Yeah,
Depends on
exactly.
their commute, yes. But I wanted to ask you, just like when you're thinking about the book that you wrote called Executive Functions for Every Classroom, and just the work that you do with Organized Binder, what's one, maybe thinking about the book specifically, what's one
Mhm.
key takeaway that you hope readers have when they walk away from reading your book?
Well, one, for the teacher, what's interesting too is how many parents have been buying it, and um, thinking about home. And
Mm,
so the whole thing with executive functions is it's about shaping the environment in ways that leads to better executive functioning. That's that clarity, routine, and modeling, right? It's not the curriculum. It's not that. The same can happen at home. I wanted it to be very, very practical. So I want teachers, I've always been very passionate about, the book really is a professional learning experience. It's PD,
mhm.
and quality PD should be relevant, but should also be very practical in my mind. Like, I could go and
Yeah.
do this tomorrow in class. And I hope teachers who read the book can do that. But more than anything, I'm hoping that we all collectively start to see that we need to take as we need yeah to take the development of these executive functioning skills, the development of that agency in students, as seriously as we do content, curriculum, testing and assessment, and even our investments in technology. Because when we do, and again, it's not either or on any of those, but when it's concurrent, when I get practice with these skills and habits, I'm more successful in all of these things. And we're making clear or explicit for students the skills and habits they're going to use to be successful in life. These aren't academic in nature. They're the things you and I use every single day to be, marginally successful, productive adults, right? I mean, it's like
Yeah.
we all need these skills, and I just hope that people are seeing, and there does seem, if there's anything the pandemic has, I think, highlighted, there seems to be this collective shift to, like, oh yeah, we need to do this, but how do we do it in a tier one way so all kids get access?
Yeah.
And that's kind of my hope, is that people are recognizing that after reading the book.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting with
Yeah.
me, and
Thanks for
I will
having me.
share all the links and different resources in our show notes so that listeners can have access. But I just appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your experiences, and
Thank you.
Excited to, I have already shared
This is
it.
fun.
I told you this earlier, but I've already shared it with people, and I'm excited to have
I
you
appreciate that.
around Branching Minds and do some different stuff with us too.
Yeah,
So
I know.
yeah.
I'm glad we're connected.
Thanks for listening to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. Go ahead and subscribe to our feed wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, if you are enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcasts on iTunes? This helps others find our podcasts and lets us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn @Branching Minds.